Thank you, Brother Joseph. Take your Bibles, if you would. Turn to the book of Luke, chapter number 17. Luke, chapter number 17. The title of the message is the same this week as it was last week. What in this world is going to happen? Started a message last week based on what we have seen in our world, really not just in the last few weeks or even the last few months, but in the last few years. However, having observed some of what has taken place in the last campaign, in the last elections, and in the aftermath of these elections, I think we can safely say our world has changed courses in the last few years. There's things that once were important to us as a nation, as a people, as individuals, which must not any longer be important to us. Having seen us turn that curve, the question that I have is, what in this world is going to happen? What's going to happen in our future? Last week I gave you 2 of 4 thoughts. The 2 thoughts that I gave you, first from Matthew chapter 24 was, much of the same will continue to happen. There in that chapter, Jesus gives us some signs of what will be taking place when He returns. We believe that we're living in the last days. We believe that we've been living in the last days literally since Jesus returned back to heaven. However, now we believe we're living in the last of the last days. I mean, it just doesn't seem like it can be long before Jesus returns. So if these were signs that He gave, which would be taking place when He returns, then we ought to be seeing more of those signs come to pass. Won't reread that text or repreach that message, but in that section He made some signs, some prophecies. Things like there would be pestilences, famines, earthquakes. Things like there would be wars and rumors of wars. Things like people's heart would continue to grow colder, harder. Now, we've been seeing those kind of things throughout this entire dispensation. However, more of the same will continue to happen. We're going to see more earthquakes. We're going to see more famines. We're going to see more wars, more rumors of wars. People's hearts will harden and get colder, even still more yet. Alabama's right now caught in the midst of a drought. I don't recall, I'm sure there's been droughts like this before, but I don't recall there being a drought this long in my lifetime. I made mention last week, if it were not for grocery stores, some of us be getting hungry about now. You can't grow crops without rain, and you can't get water out of the ground unless the rain replenishes it. So even now, we're seeing more of the same. You can expect it to intensify and to increase, but more of the same will continue. Then we looked over at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse number 3. We noted that one of the signs, one of the things that will happen in this world as it continues as that the church would continue to fall away. I say continue to fall away. It's not like we're just starting. The church has always battled falling away from the Lord. Unfortunately, right now, we seem to be losing the battle. I mentioned in 3 areas that we're falling away. We're falling away in doctrine. We don't believe what we ought to believe any longer. We're falling away in lifestyle. Christians don't live like Christians are supposed to live. And we've certainly fallen away in ministry. Churches, Christians aren't doing the type of works that God has called us to do. That falling away will continue. I believe we may have some revivals. Much could change for the better. But no matter what changes, ultimately, we're going to see more falling away of the church. For when Jesus returns, the church will have fallen away. This morning we start with point number 3. Pick up reading, if you would please, at Luke chapter 17, verse number 26. Verse 26, Jesus says, "And as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man. They did eat, they drank, they married wives. They were given in marriage unto the day that Noah entered into the ark. And the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise, also, as it was in the days of Lot, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, and they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed." Now, Jesus is still talking about what it's going to be like when He is revealed. That is, when He returns so that the world can see Him again. He's given to us a third indication of what will continue to happen in this world. He actually gives us two illustrations. He says, it will be as it was, in verse number 26, as it was in the days of Noah. He said the same type of things that were happening in Noah's day will be happening in the time when Jesus is revealed. Well, then we've got to ask the question, what was going on in Noah's day? Well, we don't have to guess because he tells us. Verse number 27, they did eat and they drank and they married wives and they were given in marriage. So he's listing three signs, three things that will be taking place in the days when Jesus returns. Basically, we summed up with three statements. They're going to eat, they're going to drink, they're going to get married. Question, is that bad? Is it bad for people to eat, to drink, and to get married? Well, we know we can eat too much. That's not good. We know we can drink the wrong beverage, and that's not good. But basically, is it wrong to eat, to drink, or to eat? No, it's not wrong. Second question I would ask is there any generation that hasn't done all three of those? And the answer would be no. Let's face it, there wouldn't be any next generation if you don't eat and drink. You pretty well have to do that to continue to live. And it's moral, it's right not only to procreate, but before you procreate, to get married. Why then is Jesus listing the sign of His return as people are eating and they're drinking and they're getting married? There's nothing wrong with eating and drinking and getting married. I had to give you my supposition here because the Bible really doesn't tell us, but I think I understand what Jesus is saying. It's not that eating and drinking and getting married is wrong. It's the way these folks were eating and drinking and getting married. You see, they were doing it without any thought for God. They were busy with their life. They were doing the eating and the drinking and the getting married. That's life. That's just what you do to live. But they were living their life without any thought for God. They were eating what pleased them. They were drinking what pleased them. They were marrying what pleased them. Every aspect of their life was centered on them, and none of it was centered on God. It's interesting, but in Luke chapter number 12, Jesus actually gave a parable along the same lines. Luke chapter 12, I believe it starts at verse number 6. He gives the parable of the man who was rich and had many fields. And so he's sitting inside of his house and he begins to think, well, what more can I do? He says, I'll tear down these small barns and I'll build me some bigger barns and I will bring in more crops and I will say to myself, eat and drink and be merry. And then Jesus closes the parable by calling him a fool. Thou fool, you don't know that tonight your soul is going to be required of you. Hey, was there anything wrong with what this man was doing? He was a good businessman. He was a good farmer. He was rearing up his crops. He was bringing them in. He was living off the bounty of his land. Was anything wrong with that? No, nothing was wrong. Why then was he a fool? Because he was living his life with no thought of God. Now, if you know the story that Jesus is referring to here in Luke chapter 17, you know that there were some sins going on in Noah's day. You could go back and look in Genesis chapter 6, verse number 5. The Bible specifically says that there was much wickedness going on in Noah's day. In fact, he says every imagination of their heart was evil continuously, which means they couldn't think a decent thought. They were so evil that every thought they had in their head was an evil thought. In chapter 6, verse number 11, he describes the violence of that day. How they were a violent people. And yet when Jesus is referring to the signs, the condition of this world when He returns, He doesn't mention the sins that Genesis describes. He just mentions the people and how they're living. How are they living? Well, they're living with no thought of God. Reckon why He doesn't mention the sins that they're committing. I want you to get something because I think it's real important. The people of Noah's day committed the sins that they committed because of their condition. Their condition was they had no thought of God. You see, there's a result of people who live their lives without considering God. The result of living your life with no thought for God, no thought what would bring Him glory, no thought what would please Him, no thought to what right and wrong is as God describes it, that kind of condition will always result
in a certain type of lifestyle. It will always result in a sinful lifestyle. If you've got no time to think of God, if you've got no desire to please God, sooner or later your mind, your heart will darken, and you will have no thoughts of righteousness either. Every thought of your heart will be wicked. It will be evil. And once your heart becomes that dark, your actions will follow. And violence and anger and hatred and wickedness will begin to brew out of your life. Could I just tell you, we're seeing that in our world today. We have an election. A lot of us weren't happy with anything that was going on during the election, but we had an election. The United States people voted, and by the system that we've established, we came up with a president-elect. And now a good portion of our nation seems to be rioting and committing acts of violence and evil. Why? Hey, it's not the sin that God looked at in Noah's day and said was wrong. Yeah, it was wrong, but it's the condition that led them to that sin that Jesus mentioned as the sign that would be filling this world when He returns. Yeah, there's violence today. Yeah, there's evil thoughts today. But it's caused by the condition. What's the condition? The condition is, hey, we're living our lives all right, but we're living them with no thought of God at all. There's actually more to be learned. You see, God saw the condition of man in Noah's day. He saw they had no thought for Him. He saw the sins in that day. And so He decides, I'm going to destroy mankind. Genesis chapter number 6. He sends Noah. He says, Noah, I want you to build me a boat, and I want you to preach to the people while you're building this boat. He says, you preach and you build for 120 years. That's a long time. If you go see the Ark Encounter, you'll find out that's a big boat. Man, it took a long time to cut those trees, hone those trees, haul those trees, plane those trees, and build that boat. Probably took all 120 years. While that boat was being built, Noah went out and preached. I don't know how often he preached. The Bible doesn't tell us. Maybe he only preached every month or two. Maybe he preached every day. Maybe he preached 3 or 4 times a day. The world wasn't as populated then as it was now. I don't think it was broke up in continents like it is today. I got a notion in 120 years, most everybody heard the message that Noah preached. I got a feeling that in that 120 years, Noah probably didn't go do any traveling, but a lot of folks came by to see this big thing he was building. And those that did not just heard, you know, there's this guy way over here in this part of the world, and he's building a giant boat. You know, before the 120 years is up, I got a feeling everybody heard what Noah was preaching. How many folks got saved? How many folks repented? How many folks got on that boat besides Noah and his family? You know the answer? Not a one. Not a one. Wait a minute. What was going on? Man's heart was cold. Man's heart was indifferent to the things of God. Why was man's heart so cold and man's heart so indifferent to God? Was it because of the sins they were committing? I imagine the sins had something to do with it, but I think it was more the result of the way they were living, the condition of their heart. People just gave no thought to God. There's a lot of people in our world today that give no thought to God. Preachers like me, we stand up and we preach. You know, we're broadcasting on the web and we're broadcasting on the TV, not our church, but others. We're broadcasting on the radio. You know, there's really no excuse for anybody in this country. There's no excuse hardly for anybody in this world not to know who Jesus Christ is. But most folks aren't getting on the ark, are they? Most folks aren't repenting. Why? We're suffering from the same condition they were in Noah's day. People just don't give any thought to God. Well, he gives us 2 examples here. Verse number 26, 27, he gives us the example of Noah. But in verse number 29, he gives us another example. This time he mentions Lot. Verse 29, and the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. He's given us another character to help us to understand what's going to continue to happen in this world. He mentions Lot. And he mentions Sodom. Now, if you know anything about Lot and Sodom, you know the sin that the people were committing during that time period was sodomy, homosexuality. Book of Genesis describes very carefully what was going on inside that city. But I notice in this verse that as Jesus is describing the sin which will mark His return, He never mentions sodomy. He never mentions homosexuality. Now he could. That was the sin that's associated with Lot and with Sodom. But he doesn't mention the sin. Why not? I think he's thinking along the lines of some other condition. Notice the way he describes the way people were living during that day. He doesn't describe them as being sodomites. Look again at verse number 9. He says, likewise also as it was in the days of Lot. How were they living? They did eat, they drank, they bought, and they sold. They planted, and they builded. Now wait a minute, there's 6 things. He pairs them up so you can remember them easier. They ate, and they drank, they bought, and they sold, they planted, and they builded. They were just living. But he doesn't mention the sin of sodomy, the predominant sin that's associated with that account. He's not talking about the sin will be the predominant thing that's taking place when he returns. He's talking about them living again, just like he was talking about them living in the days of Noah. They ate, and they drank, and they married. Why is he looking at the way that they live instead of the sin they committed? Because the way they lived is what caused the sin that they committed. How did they live? They lived their life with no thought of God. They went out and worked just like everybody's supposed to go out and work. They went out and ate just like everybody's supposed to go out and eat. They went out and lived like everybody's supposed to live. But they lived their life with no thought of God. Both of these characters, both of these Bible passages is pointing us in the same direction. It's not the sins that you need to be watching for in the end of the age. It's the condition of these people's hearts. They lived their life, but they lived their life with no thought of God. And I tell you, we're living in a world like that. I mean, people today, they live their life based on what they want. They live their life on how much money they can make. They live their life based on how much pleasure it brings them. We're living in a world today where people are busy doing all the things that these verses describe. And the things that they're doing are not wrong. They're just living their life with no thought of God. You know what's really sad? That's not just the way the lost world is living. That's the way a whole lot of folks inside the church are living. Churches today are closing up because Christians don't think it's important enough to go to church anymore. They've got things that they want to do. They've got life that they need to live. They want to eat and to drink and to have their own pleasures, to build their own kingdoms. The Bible today, perhaps the most owned book in all the world, is sadly one of the least read books in all the world. Most everybody has a copy of the Bible. It sits in a prominent place of their house, on a mantle or on a table. Many of them have their own Bibles beside their beds on a nightstand, but it doesn't get read. Christians, people who call themselves believers, they do not read it. Why? Because they're not going to do what it says if they were to read it. They've got no thought for God in their life. What's the condition that will continue in this world until Jesus comes? What in this world is going to happen? More and more people, both lost and saved, will live their lives with no thought of God. Now, I mentioned this last week. I'm going to mention it again this week. We're talking about the world at large. What's going to happen in this world? Well, more and more of the same will continue. More and more the church will fall away. More and more people will live their lives with no thought of God. That's what the world is going to do. But the question that really pertains to you this morning is not what is going to happen to this world. The question that pertains to you is, what's going to happen to you? How about you, Christian? You who call yourself a believer of the Bible. Did you know in the United States of America, only approximately 3% of Americans are atheists? Only 3%. If you want to add the agnostics to that, about 4% of Americans are agnostics. Now, an agnostic is somebody who believes that there is probably a God, but that He just doesn't matter. So you've got approximately 8%, actually a little bit less than 8% of the American population today, who believes either there is no God or there is a God that just doesn't matter. Which means over 92% of the American people in this country today, 92% believe there is a God and He matters. 92% believe there's a God and God matters. If 92% of the folks believe there's a God, and they believe that God matters, how come we're living our life in such rebellion to God? How come we're living our life contrary to the Word of God? How come the desires of God, the things that would honor and please God, mean so little to us in this age? It ought not be so, my friend. The question is not this morning what will happen to the world. The question this morning is what will happen in your life. What will happen in this world? Number one, more of the same. Number two, the church will fall away. Number three, people will continue without thought of God. Number four, take your Bibles, turn to the book of Romans, chapter number 1. Sin will increase. I'm thinking now, what's going to happen in this world since this world has made its abrupt decision, its decision to go a way opposite from God? I don't think there's any question. All three of the things I've mentioned thus far, and this fourth thing, sin will continue. All four of these things will continue. In the book of Romans, chapter 1, beginning at verse number 19, all the way down to the end of the chapter, what we have is a description of the spiraling down of sinners. How sinners reach the bottom of the sin pool. Now, we read these verses and allude to these verses quite often because it's such an appropriate description of the way people are living today. I'm not going to read all of these verses today because it would take too long and because we are fairly familiar with them. I refer to them often. But I want you to notice some key verses that describe how sin will increase. I've got 5 sections marked. I'm calling these 5 platforms. They're actually places where man stops and has the opportunity either repent and go back up to God, or else he's got the opportunity to step off of that platform and to go further into sin. You tell me which way you think our country is going to go. Start reading at verse number 21. I call this platform number 1. He says in verse number 21, because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. He's describing people who know something about God, but having known something about God, they refuse to honor Him. They refuse to obey Him. They refuse to serve Him. Actually, this is the condition that I've been describing so far in this message. This is point number 3. People who know there is a God. People who know God matters, but they live their life as though God doesn't matter. In that verse, he describes what will happen if they continue in this path. Look what he says. When they knew God, they glorified Him not, neither were thankful, but they became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. What happens to a people who know there's a God but refuse to obey that God? Who knows there's a God who matters but lives their life as though He does not? The same thing happens to them that happened to those of Noah's day. The same thing happens to them that happened to those in Lot's day. Their minds get darkened, incapable of thinking true thoughts any longer, incapable of knowing right from wrong. Their imaginations become blackened so that every thought of their heart is evil only continuously. And they begin to do more and more wickedness. Now, friend, I'm telling you, this is true of the person who sits on a pew as much as it is of those who sit on a bar stool or in a nightclub or a strip joint or a drug house. You see, this is just a principle of the Word of God. If you know something about God and then you choose to ignore that truth, you refuse to give God His place, His glory, that which is rightfully His position in your life, without fail, sin will always increase in your life. You've probably heard many preachers say it before, but you can't straddle the fence with God. You're either with Him or you're against Him. There's no holding on in one place. God is always revealing more of Himself. God is always showing you more of His will, of His design, of the things that please Him. If He's in your heart, my friend, you can't lock Him in a closet. He's always seeking more control. He's always seeking to fill your life with more of His presence. And because He's always actively working in your heart, if you're going to close Him out, you must always be shutting the door, slamming it before Him, which means sin in your life will always be increasing. What will continue to happen in this world? Sin will increase. This is just platform number one. Notice he describes another platform. Look at verse number 24. He says, wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Now, verse number 24 could be talking about homosexuality, but I don't think it is yet. I think homosexuality doesn't come in until we get to platform number 4. I've said this before. In order for people to commit homosexuality, they have to be pretty well down the spiral of sin. Homosexuality is not a sin that somebody who's new to sin is going to commit. You pretty well have to have your heart darkened to step over that ledge in that lifestyle. We're just at platform number 2. I think homosexuality comes in at platform number 4. So what's he talking about at platform number 2? He's saying those who choose to go after their own lust, even to the place where they dishonor their own bodies, where it hurts their bodies to do it. He's talking about those who do sins and they know by doing that sin it's going to hurt their body. There's all kinds of sins like that. Smoking is that type of a sin. Drinking is that type of a sin. Sexual perversion is that type of a sin. Drugs are that type. You know, there's a whole range of things that we can do to our own bodies, and we know that we ought not do them, but we want that thing. We want that object, whatever it is, whether it's a drug, whether it's a high, whether it's the dollar we can make by overworking ourselves, whether it's a fulfillment of lustful desire, whatever it is, pornography, whatever it is, we know it's bad for us, but we don't care. We want it, and we want it so bad, we don't care what it does to our bodies. Now, indeed, that is homosexuality. Oh, but there's a whole bunch of things that are just as deadly to the body that we can lust after and choose before we choose our God. Now listen, he's describing this as a platform. This is a place. You know this is wrong. You know this is hurting you. But if you give in to your lust, you'll be going further down the spiral. This is an opportunity for you to stop, gain some sense about what you're doing, understanding that what you're doing is wrong, and say, God, I'm not going to do this. My body is the temple of God. I'm going to turn around. I'm going to start to please you. I will not go further down this spiral. I'm going to start climbing the ladder upwards. Most people choose to continue spiraling down. That's the reason it's so hard to help an addict. You've often heard the expression, you can't help a drug addict who doesn't want to be helped. You can't help an alcoholic who doesn't want. They've got to come to the place where they say, this is killing me. This is killing others. I've got to get off of this stairwell down. I've got to make a change in my life. This is a place where people can stop and turn around. But most continue the spiral down. What will happen in this world? Sin will increase. Look at the third platform that he mentions. It's found in verse number 25. He says, who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshiped and served the creator more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. What's the third platform? In this spiraling down, if sin's going to continue to abide, people are going to know what God is, what God wants, and refuse Him. People are going to begin to do things that hurt themselves. What's the third platform going down? Instead of worshiping the Creator, they'll worship the creation. Now, in my observations, this particular sin has not become prevalent yet in our country. Actually, right now in our country, what it seems to be is our country is very anti-religion altogether. By and large, people today are throwing rocks at anything that's religious. Anybody that's Christian, anybody that's any religion, a lot of folks just throwing rocks. Right now, there's not a whole lot of worshiping things either, as far as we know. However, I predict in our country, we're going to see things change. You see, you need to understand that the devil who's in charge of this age, the devil who is bringing much of this wickedness to pass, he doesn't want religion to be stopped. The devil's ultimate goal is not that we would stop worshiping, but that we would start to worship him. And so at some point, he's going to begin to build religion back up. Right now, he's trying to tear down true religion. And to do that, maybe he's dragging all religions down. But you mark her down, before long, people are going to start worshiping things again. Some already are. I've described to you how they almost rebuilt the Temple of Baal in New York. I've described to you how there are actually churches of Satan that are having after-school programs in the cities of our schools. In the city schools today, churches of Satan are having after-the-school clubs. I've given you those articles. More and more, you're going to see that type of stuff arise where people are actually worshiping things. Maybe they'll worship the animals again. Maybe they already are. I don't know. It seems like folks today have gone completely bonkers about what an animal is. God love you. I know you love your dogs, and I know you love your cats. Some of you are getting a little bit close there to bowing down and worshiping some of those things. I always kid my family. I say, you worship the dog. No, I don't say that. I say, you think a lot of the dogs and the cats, but you kill the roaches. What's the matter with you there? That's not right. But it seems like as the age progresses, we will start worshiping more of the things. It's a platform. It's a place where people ought to wake up and say, hey, these things aren't our God. God is our God. But in the spiraling down, people will know who God is and refuse Him. People will do things that damage their own bodies. And people will worship the things instead of the God who created the things. Look at the fourth platform. It's in verse number 26 and 27. He says, and for this cause, God gave them up into vile affections. For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the women, burning in their lust one toward another. Men with men working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meat. Now that is a reference to homosexuality. Could I just tell you, I don't really want to talk about homosexuality any more than you want to hear about homosexuality. However, if you're going to talk end time, if you're going to talk Bible prophecy, if you're going to talk about the condition of the world when Jesus comes back, you're going to have to talk about homosexuality. Because it's right there. Right there. Platform number 4. As the man continues his downward spiral, he's rejected God. He's been doing things already that hurt his body, but because he lusted for it, he went ahead and did it. He's going to start worshiping things instead of the Creator. And at some point in this downward spiral, he will lose the understanding of what God created human beings for. Instead of male and female relationships, it will be female and female relationships and male relationships. I think it's Genesis chapter number 11 where Sodom and Gomorrah is talked about. Genesis chapter number 11. In Genesis chapter number 11, we have the first biblical reference to sodomy. Matter of fact, it's called sodomy after Sodom and Gomorrah. So obviously this homosexual business has been around a long time. Genesis 11, that's all the way back towards the beginning of the Bible. And in these thousands of years that have passed since Sodom and Gomorrah, there's no doubt in my mind that there have been households and communities and maybe more cities and maybe even nations that have given themselves over to this particular sin. But you are living in a time where something is taking place that has never happened in the history of mankind before. You're living and you're seeing it happen where the whole world at one time is embracing this sin as acceptable. Friend, that has never happened in the history of the world before. Why is it happening now? Because the closer we get to the return of Jesus, the more sin will increase. The more people will know who God is and yet refuse to honor God. The more people will lust after things and do them even if they destroy their own bodies. The more people will worship the things of this world instead of the God who created it. And the more people will lose their understanding of male and female roles, responsibilities, privileges, joys. One of the conditions of sin that will increase is the sin of homosexuality. The fifth and the last. Look down at the last few verses. Where's all this taking us? What's the ultimate end? What's at the bottom of this stairwell going down? Verse 29. Being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetous, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful. What's he describing? He's describing the ultimate end of walking down this stairwell or falling down this stairwell is an abundance of all kinds of sins. You go back and you read that list, and my friend, he's got just about everything included in it. He's talking about betrayal. He's talking about unfaithfulness. He's talking about an evil spirit. He's talking about being a murderer, a killer, disobeying, dishonoring your parents, hating God. Every wicked sin you can conceive is mentioned in that list somehow. Why? Because the closer we get to the end of this age, sin will increase more and more and more until literally there won't be anything that's wrong, anything that's evil that mankind's not engaging in. What in this world is going to happen? Sin is going to increase. Four things are going to happen. More of the same. One of these days, I predict California will break off and fall off the coast. Some earthquake will crack that San Andreas fault, and it'll go sailing off. But I got news for you. One might just split Alabama off the rest of the continent too. Because there's going to be an abundance of earthquakes. There's going to be more wars, more famines. People are going to die of starvation. They're going to die of thirst. Why? More of the same is going to go on. Church is going to become so impotent, so fallen away, so powerless that one day God will have to take them home. I don't think we're going to go home with a parade. I think we're going to go home with shame because we've lost all of our power. We've lost all of our understanding of what God's called us to do. Sin will increase because man's heart will scratch God off. We'll just strike God out of our mind. The question, though, is not what will happen in this world. The question is what will happen in your heart. The question is what will happen in your home. The question is what will happen in your church. If God's people would choose Christ over this world, prayer over television, entertainment, obedience to the Bible over their own selfish pleasures and desires, if God's people would seek after the God of this Bible, the Bible promises us that God would change the world for the sake of the saved. The question today is not what's going to happen in this world. The question is what's going to happen with you. Because you determine your life and you determine your family and you determine to a great extent the world that you live in. This morning, you can change the world. I pray God we will. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for the opportunity to preach. I thank you for the book to preach.